So we'll invite the next session up, Pearl O'Rourke. She's going to talk about ECMO Origins with her crew. So come on up, everybody.
A general surgeon in Santa Barbara, California, was a guy who'd also been at the Children's when we were there, named Tom O'Brien. He knew what we were doing. So he had a patient, it was a young man with what you'd now call ARDS, who was dying in a little hospital in Santa Barbara. So he called us up and said, "You guys have that machine, you want to try this on my patient?" And I said, "No, we're not ready for that, but there's a guy in San Francisco who's actually done 6 cases already, it's Don Hill." I called him, he came to Santa Barbara with his machine, we went to Santa Barbara, and Don Hill managed that whole case. The patient wasn't on very long, about 2 days, but recovered at the end of it. So that was the first successful case.
Good morning. I would like to have you imagine 3 other people up here who will be joining us by Zoom. The weather, unfortunately, explains their absence. We are standing between you and lunch, and we are proud of that. Okay, so here is our group here. And actually, our first speaker is Don Hill, and he will be joining us by Zoom. And I think many of us have given ECMO lectures, and we show the famous picture of that adult patient that Don Hill was really the first successful one reported. And yet many of us have never really talked with Don Hill. So we were ecstatic of having him on this panel. And unfortunately, he has to do it remotely. So Don, let's start off with you. And we have given him a big portion of the time because we really feel that his story is so integral to why we're all here. Thank you, Don.
Yeah, I know, I do it. You still got it?
Yeah, we can hear you. And you look great.
Okay. Right now?
Yeah, we can hear you. Yeah, it's coming through fine.
Good morning. This is Don Hill in San Francisco. I'm a cardiac surgeon at California Pacific Medical Center. I have listened in awe of all this work that's been going on in the 80s and 90s, but I'm going to take you back to 1950 to 1965, partly set the stage for how we got there and the incredible role that Bob played in that. So to go to the very beginning, an important thing happened in 1930. You've all heard this story a lot of times, and the reason that I'm showing this is if you look in the center one, Watson at AMI, he got nowhere until he got an engineer on board. And you know, engineers in medicine were largely unknown in that stage, but that changed everything. In '53, he did the first closure, and that did 2 important things. It eliminated cross circulation as a technology for open heart surgery, and it also eliminated hypothermia. And things started to move much more rapidly after that. One other person that should be brought up is Clarence Dennis, who was working out of Minnesota. And like everybody, he was trying to get a heart-lung machine to do open heart surgery. However, he was one of the very, very first persons that had an interest in prolonged extracorporeal circulation. And here you see him with a dog. And I want to go a little further in this because he plays an important role serendipitously on how ECMO got going successfully. In 1955, he did first open heart surgery in New York State, and then he was still interested in prolonged extracorporeal circulation in the 1960s, took a sabbatical with Aki Sanin at the Karolinska Institute in Stockholm, Sweden. When he was there, he developed with Collins a cannula, steel cannula, which was a tube with a trocar down the middle. And here you see that cannula. This cannula was put down into the right atrium, do a transeptal puncture blindly in dogs, but with fluoroscopy in humans, pull out this trocar, and then you had a bypass, a left heart bypass. This goes down here, heart-lung machine, back into the femoral artery. The reason I bring this up is that he left there in the sabbatical in June 1961, and I came in July 1961 to begin a fellowship. I was in my mid-20s, and I inherited this project. And in the following 18 months, I did about 200 dog experiments, wrote 6 papers on this subject. And when I left to come back to Canada and United States, I brought one of these cannulas with me, and that cannula will surface in part of the beginning of the successful use of ECMO. By the mid-60s, all these kind of surgeons, they had a system that would allow them to work inside the heart for 90 minutes, and that's all they needed. So a lot of the impetus for having a membrane oxygenator disappeared because of that. Membranes had been started, been worked on, all these people supported them, but once they could get inside the heart for 90 minutes safely, they cared about it, but they mostly wanted to fix hearts, fix VSDs, tetralogy of Fallot's, all that early stuff that was going on. So there was 4 guys that were young at that time in the mid-60s that were actually working and had developed these membranes, possibly for long term, but more likely at that time, at that moment, for routine heart surgery, because it was considered to be the best. But we found out that it wasn't needed, that one. And Bob was at that time at the Brigham. Warren Zappel was an anesthesiologist at the MGH. Arnie Landy was in Minnesota with Lily High, and I was at CPMC. I'll just briefly, at that time, what did you need, and you still need today? To do this work, you needed a membrane oxygenator. You had to have one. You couldn't do experiment with it without one. You had to have engineering support. You had to have curiosity, energy, resourcefulness, and time. You had to have patience. You had to have reach. You had to have support with your department, support with your institution, all these things. And when I was listening to earlier and what was going on in the 80s and 90s, Bob understood, knew that, did it, and gave you all those things. And we learned it ourselves in these days, of the early days of the 60s and early 70s. Warren Zappel hooked up with Ted Collaboo at NIH, and they worked on their own oxygenator, became the SciMed oxygenator. Arnie Landy worked with Edwards and with Lily High in Minnesota to get really a pretty good oxygenator for routine open heart surgery. But sort of that disappeared because the discs and bubblers soon would take the place of it. So there was no real place for membrane oxygenator development going on. Bob had his own. He worked with Phil Drinker, and Phil Drinker had a long history in pulmonary. His father had developed the lungs for people with polio in the 30s, the iron lungs. So he was a natural there, and he was welcomed by Bob, and they worked on oxygenators together as well. And I was at California Pacific Medical Center, and they already, Gerbode and Osborne, who were my chiefs there, I came in 64, and they'd already been working on the Bramson oxygenator, and it was ready to be tested. And I got the job of doing it, which I loved, and I did it for 3 years. I did dozens of dogs. By this time, we were aiming for a long-term perfusion and not useful, not just to do it for routine open heart surgery. And this was a big oxygenator It was never going to be commercial. It was very labor intensive. It was very highly engineered. You can see it had 3 pumps on it. It was designed for routine open heart surgery. It was never used seriously in that because the simpler disposable things took their place, and not only Medicare would replace them soon. So we really concentrated only on membrane support. So what was the first case and how did we successfully pull it off? It took place in Santa Barbara at Cottage Hospital. And the surgeon that received the patient at that time was Tom O'Brien, and he was a Brigham trained general thoracic and cardiac surgeon who had moved to Santa Barbara, and he was the receiving physician that got this patient. At this point in 1970, I and other people, I myself had done about 10 or 12 ECMOs unsuccessfully, usually pneumonias, usually young people, and usually with a lot of pulmonary fibrosis developed, and we could never get the lung to repair. This was a trauma case, and the patient was 24, male, blunt trauma, arrived within 30 minutes to the emergency room, was conscious, severe pain, blood pressure was 74/30, heart rate 130, respiratory rate 32, hypovolemic, had multiple fractures of his lower extremities and peripheral nerve damage. And the first thing they discovered on routine chest x-ray was this widened mediastinum. He had a sub-adventitial traumatic aneurysm, but he had 6 fractures besides. All his ramus here, his ramus there, his acetablons, both knees, both tibia, fibula were fractured. First thing was go to the OR and get that fixed. And that was done with left thoracotomy. This was a pretty well-known technology at the time. Partial bypass through a left groin allowed you to clamp the aorta safely and keep the upper part of the heart oxygenated, and that went very well. Fractures were put on balanced traction, and we looked for emboli because of all the traumas and never found any fat emboli. So the first day he did very good, 100% saturated, 324 millimeters of mercury, PaO2, PCO2, 25, etc. However, by the 4th day, he had deteriorated. This was his check stray, 100%. FiO2, PO2 dropped to 45, PEEP was on at 5, and PO2 was 25. Also, his airway pressure was up to 60. And so he was considering, what can I do next? Now I'm going to switch the story to San Francisco because this was an important connection. San Francisco General Hospital, a cardiac surgeon, on this same day had a patient, 32-year-old female law student with severe bilateral aspiration pneumonia. She was 2 weeks from writing her exams. She'd eaten a huge meal, drank 3/4 of a quart of whiskey, and was inebriated, vomited, and aspirated. And he knew me because I had been invited up there to use that cannula that I brought back from Stockholm, and I got to know him at that time, and he knew I was working with membrane oxygenators, so he called me up. He later became a really guru in trauma surgery as well. So he called me, and I told him I can be there in 2 hours. This time I had already done a lot of distance things. I'd been to Winnipeg twice, flown up there with this equipment to treat trauma patients and pneumonia patients unsuccessfully, always unsuccessfully. But I had this chance to do that. So while I was there, I got there by 4 o'clock, and Barry Fairley arrived on the scene. And Barry Fairley was a superb anesthesiologist, English trained, had gone to Toronto, was on the respiratory team there, helped set up the pulmonary program there. And he was then recruited to UCSF. He was the assistant head of the department. And on Thursday afternoons at 4 o'clock, he always did rounds. And he was the chief at San Francisco General Hospital. And he asked, what's going on here? And Don Trunke said what we were doing. And he looked at me and he said, who are you? And I said, I was at CPMC. He knew CPMC well because we had a fairly good, very good intensive care unit. And I explained what we were doing. There was a number of people around the country who were doing it. And he asked, well, what are the outcomes? And I said, there's been no survivors. And so he was very professional and very polite, but he clearly told both of us that this is over, take the equipment home. We're going to try hypothermia, and the hypothermia on this girl. He didn't want to try something that had never succeeded. And so I went home and took my equipment. Meanwhile, Tom O'Brien was trying to figure out what to do. He's there at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, still can't get anything to work and can't get this better. And so he had in his mind, he remembered there was this guy Bartlett who was playing with a device support pulmonary failure. I'll call him. So he found out that he was now at UC Irvine. I added that little top to this slide for Bob. And he called Bob, and Bob told him, he says, I'm down here now. My equipment isn't set up, but called Don Hill in San Francisco. He called me and I said, I can fly down there tonight. And I called Military Air Command. They flew us all down and we arrived there that evening, a Thursday night. And Tom and the day 5, we spent 19 hours looking at this patient, during which time we gave massive diuresis, 3,500 cc's in 9 hours, and he was started already on methylprednisolone, but PO2s were basically 34. So at around 19 hours, we put him on ECMO, and you're all familiar, I'm sure, with this setup. I chose to do AV at this time because I was worried that this heart might have contusion. He had a huge trauma and fractures, and this was a standard cannulation bilaterally in the right groin and through a compliant chamber, through a pump membrane oxygenator, back to the patient. Duration was 75 hours. Flows were about 3 liters, and PO2s went up to 75, reduced the FiO2 to 60. Airway pressure dropped to 35. Platelets were eaten up. We replaced that. Also gave a lot of fresh frozen plasma. Free hemoglobin went up to 31. And the Lee-White clotting time was kept around 25 to 30. We actually were mainly using ACT. Heddersley, who invented ACT, was up in Sacramento. He had sent me some of those test tubes that had dirt in the bottom of them. And we learned to use those, and they were much, much better. And we later reported on that. So there was no significant bleeding during this time. Mental agitation ceased, confusion continued. After 2 days, the lungs dramatically improved. We were sort of looking at this, is this going to get better or not? And it just did in 2 days. And over a period of slowly weaning him, sort of like 2 to 3 hours at a time, dropped the flows down, 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 take it off, and decannulated them, still intubated. And we looked through the heart-lung machine and there was no evidence of any thrombus anywhere, which was nice to see. And it was almost always what we did see. There's this picture, and on the Saturday of this bypass, we were all staying with this patient constantly. I had a team of 5 people with me, and I was off having a sleep in the afternoon sometime. Bob drove up from Irvine, and everybody told him everything was going on. He looked at everything for a couple hours, and he took this picture. Thank God he took it, and he later gave it to me because that's the only record that we have this, and you can see what kind of a disorganized system we had in those days, but everything actually we needed that was a very good intensive care unit, and Tom O'Brien, who took care of him, was a very good internist besides being a very good surgeon and organizer. So post-op for day 1 to 29 continued to be confused. He even got burr holes. No explanation was ever found. It was thought to be maybe due to over dehydration. He had a fever that was treated with a lot of antibiotics and just stopped on day 29, 8 weeks after he was transferred to an orthopedic rehab, and then pulmonary capacity at 14 weeks is 64%. Maximum respiratory flow was normal. Maximum voluntary ventilation 78%, and his PO2 was 75 on room air. So that was a success. If anybody that wants to know more detail about this, it was reported in the New England Journal of Medicine, 6 pages, and it's loaded with data that I couldn't possibly report in this short time. So now I just go on to the very last thing I'm going to say a word about, and that was defining the role of ECMO and the trial. In this case, so far we had a first successful case, and that was followed with 150 cases with approximately a 10% survival rate. ECMO was gathering momentum as a therapy, and bedside management was improving. I was doing lung biopsies and open lung biopsies, and was more and more documenting fibrosis in pneumonia patients. We also learned how to use ACT much better as a monitoring system. We also learned a lot about how to move people around with all these cannulas in them because we couldn't get them out of bed. And but most importantly and discouraging, because routine disc oxygenators, bubble oxygenators, also at this time now, serious work on membrane oxygenators was disappearing. GE pulled theirs off the way. Edwards got discouraged about land deoxygenator, and there was no really work going on in that area at all. But we did have a first successful case. So arrived on the scene was Claude L'Enfant, and he came appointed in NIH in 1972. And the one thing that he came with a memory of was that following Christian Bernard's successful heart transplant, there was a period in 68, 69, and 70 where a couple of hundred open heart transplants were done all over the world by every center you could imagine. Nobody knew what they were doing and had about a 90% mortality rate. And he didn't want that happen to ECMO. So he called myself and Bob and several other people to come and talk about doing a trial on ECMO, because he didn't want another circus with ECMO like had happened with heart transplantation. And so we were in our late 30s, late 20s and early 30s. We didn't know a whole lot about grants and contracts at the time. And so he talked us into it to do it because he wanted to either show that it worked or to get rid of it. And the trial had 9 centers, only 3 of which had any experience doing it. That turned out to be a really big mistake. And as you can see, this was a problem that 65% of the patients, there was 90 patients total, 65% of them had pneumonia. And we already knew pneumonia was a bad form of acute pulmonary disease to recover. And there are a few traumas and a few other pulmonary embolism. The results were awful. And as you can see, at 12 days, probably just about 90% of people died. There was no difference in the therapies. And in 1979, Warren reported on this whole trial, and it was a very discouraging report because of no survival. Bob was really upset with it because this was 79. He was well along in saving ECMO because it didn't work in adults by using it in kids and in pediatrics and in neonates. and it was massively discouraging to the job that he was trying to get done. And he never forgave everybody for allowing that to be published. However, it had to be published, and L'Enfant insisted that it be published, but it didn't serve a good purpose at the time. It was really bad. One good thing came out of it, that he did the trial and got the contract to track the natural history of acute pulmonary disease and the comorbidities that gave you success or failure. This was crucial information. The trial failed for a lot of reasons, and one of which, we didn't know the natural history of the disease we were treating. We didn't. It would have been made more sense if we had not compared ECMO to whether it worked or didn't work. It would have been better to just take acute respiratory patients and treat them with ECMO to find out, number one, can the lung recover? We didn't know lung would recover. And then what we had on the biopsies from pneumonia, most often they went on to pulmonary fibrosis. And so established that the lung had the capacity to recovery was crucial. And this trial that Bob organized was crucial in getting that kind of information. And this sort of work should have done before the trial ever took place. So he was pretty discouraged at that time. Adult people were sort of against it, and ECMO was holding on by his fingertips. However, he saved the day for ECMO by being in a place and organizing how to do it in neonates and save the day. And, you know, during the next 10 to 15 years, that work kept ECMO alive. We continued to do ECMO. I wasn't in a center that could do neonates at all. And I had more moved on to doing LVADs and breast transplants and chronic heart development technology. But I did ECMOs with adults when I did, and I had some successes. But on the whole, the success really was due to Bob and his success and building the team and building the organization and building the worldwide organization to collect the information, publish the information, and to train and teach people. And I was just interested in all the support that came out of that effort, and all the trainees that talked about doing this in the 80s and 90s. So this is the last time I talked with Bob. This is taken in June of 2023. I had dinner with him. We rehashed sometime the old days, but he mainly talked about what he was doing, other people are doing, what's going on, and exhibited the enormous optimism he always had for doing everything. And he always positioned himself in the middle of the argument and would try to solve problems, very creative, very understanding of bringing in technology, finding out what the problem is, solving the problem. And I was privileged to know him and work with him a lot, particularly in the 70s, but to be a friend of his, you know, for the rest of our lives. So thank you very much for this opportunity to present this. And I was so happy to be able to do it and to pay tribute to a great friend and a great surgeon. Thank you.
Thank you, Don. Thank you very much. We wished you were here with us. Next, we're going to John Tomazian, who has been there from the very beginning. So, John?
Good morning, everyone. It's a great pleasure and very flattering to be part of the who's who of Robert Bartlett's life, both personally and professionally. In the next few moments, I'll go over the decade of the time at the University of California, Irvine. Some of these slides you've seen before, some of them have been patented by Robert Bartlett, but the first thing I need to let you all know is the early days of ECMO, they were hard to recruit patients. So one of us had to drive up and down the Santa Ana freeway with Bartlett's customized license plate directing you to the Chapman Avenue exit to recruit patients at UCI. Why did Bartlett go to Irvine? Well, Irvine had no football team. It just had a brand new medical school, so a guy such as Robert Bartlett could concentrate on his research and didn't have to worry about the anxieties of a football team. Well, Bartlett always said, how do you find the lab at UC Irvine? Well, you get to Southern California, it's sort of get into Orange County and keep turning right. Keep turning right, keep turning right, and eventually you get to the UC Irvine Medical Center, which was in Orange, California. Here you see a picture of Robert Bartlett and Al Gazzaniga. How did I fit in? Well, I was an undergraduate pre-medical student, biological science student at UCI. They said the way you get into medical school is you go work for a professor, get your name on a paper, publish a paper, and then get your letter of recommendation, you get in. Well, they didn't tell me about the GPA part, so that part didn't work for me getting into medical school. But when we got to the lab, you can see here Bartlett, and I worked for his partner, Al Gazzaniga, who wore size 9 gloves and could put 8-O-proline through little pericardial sutures into the ventricles and the atrium of these little babies. And also in Barbara Town, you can also see there, Barbara was a graduate of the UCI surgery program. But I worked for Al Gazzaniga, and Gazzaniga and Bartlett shared this laboratory space, which was Building 18, which is an old primate vivarium. You never knew what was going to go on there, except the foliage around it was very well fertilized by the excrement of the animals that we took care of. We had an avocado tree that people frequented, and we never really told them how well it grew and why it grew. The lab had a sign on the outside that said, "Danger, keep out," and that was probably a good reason, because you never knew what was going on. But sheep from all over Orange County wanted to be part of this experience, because it was really important in the 70s, because we didn't know what the hell we were doing. We couldn't spell ACT, much less try to manage it. So what happened in the lab? The laboratory learned how to support chronic animals very, very quickly. A day in the lab was a week on a patient. We learned how to titrate ACTs. We developed devices. We learned about biomaterials, silicone rubber, and other things that were paramount to clinical work, and foreign surface interaction and characterization. Bartlett was a master of success, but he couldn't do it without his foot soldiers. And he accumulated a wonderful crew of people at UCI, and I wanted to highlight 3 of them. And there were many, many of them. First on the left is Vern Rook. Vern Rook was a PhD from UC Davis, a mastermind of basic science and physiology. He was a biomaterials expert. He ran the lab, and in the 6 decades of the Bartlett Laboratory, there was no one finer than Vern Rook. Nancy Wetmore, shown in the middle here, was the first research nurse that Bartlett had. The only way you got to the clinical was through Nancy. I was fortunate to have a good rapport with her, and she trained me how to be an ECMO tech at the time, which later morphed to be an ECMO specialist. The next slide shows Nick Haydick. Nick Haydick is one of the unsung heroes of Bartlett's project. Nick was the perfusionist who somehow mysteriously appeared with a perfectly tailored circuit. Unbeknownst to anybody, he always knew when the patients would show up. They ran flawlessly, and Nick was always a guy that was in the background, never asking for accolades or so. There were moments of frustration and clinical triumph. Here you can see on the left, we were very good at decorating the walls at failed experiments, and we liked the hue of red oftentimes. You always took your wardrobe, you had to be careful if you walked in the lab, you didn't know if it would come out the same way. Here you can see Bartlett and Nick Haydick and a crew of the folks after a failed experiment, which was really sort of fun. We evaluated lots of devices, and one in the middle is what we referred to as the shaker. The shaker was the size of a washing machine. It had platforms of silicone rubber. It was weighted down by a weight, and it would exchange gas, but then what you do is engage the thing, and it would twist back and forth, and that induced secondary flows. And all the things we know about secondary blood flows in artificial devices were gathered from stuff like this. You've also always heard about Esperanza, and Esperanza is a focal point and a feature of the Bartlett legacy, but you never hear about number 2 and number 3. Well, number 2 is Gerald Moreno, and number 3 is Hector Loera. Here you can see the parents holding Gerald on the left, and the great Kathy Higgins, the nurse that did everything so perfectly, holding Hector Loera on the right. Hector Loera was a little bit of an enigma. He was a 32-weeker, 1.8-kilogram baby that somehow survived. And those little babies were never, ever really cared for successfully, but Loera was an enigma of that. And it led to more of that being studied over time. Now, the early clinical experience was rather interesting. We did 21 adults at UC Irvine. Only one of them survived. That was Lynn Meyer, who was an Air Force transport from Albuquerque, New Mexico, on ECMO that flew into El Toro base and was transferred to UCI and successfully supported. But here you see on the left, this is how we studied adductus. There was no such thing as cardiac ultrasound at the time, so we bring a C-arm into the corner of the unit, irradiate the entire neonatal ICU, and study if the patient had a left to right shunt. Esperanza had a left to right shunt and was ligated successfully in the unit. The picture in the middle is a very interesting one because that was taken in the 70s. And if you notice the patient is extubated. Did anybody ever do that in the 70s? Did anyone do that in the 80s, 90s, or even the teens before extubation got popular for ambulatory ECMO patients? We did that at UC Irvine. Also, you can see how the patient here on the right was elevated. We have a Landay-Edwards membrane oxygenator on the bottom. It was the size of a car battery. It was 3 square meters. It was huge. If you took care of an adult, you needed 4, 5, or 6 of them running in series to oxygenate the patient. As Irvine went on, we morphed over the 50 years. We transitioned from UCI to U of M. You see Esperanza there in the middle. She was referred to as Pineda because her name was Hope Pineda. So I always referred to her as Pineda. And you can see her there on the right 30 years later at one of the conferences. The picture of Bartlett on the left is my favorite of all time. That's that barrel chest, swashbuckling look about him. But what touches me is the little girl in front of him. If I could adopt a younger daughter or have a younger sister, that would be the one I would adopt. Now, Irvine was fast 10 years, and we transitioned to Ann Arbor in 1980. Here you see the Kresge building on the left. We were on the 7th floor. Eventually, over time, the whole 7th floor was overcome or run over by the people there. The laboratory shown in the middle, some of the same stuff that we had at Irvine transition. And then just for Charlie Stoller, I can show you there's the ACT tester that we actually did use, Charlie, in taking care of patients along with small silicone rubber Symed Colobo oxygenator in the neonatal ICU as we went. As we settle in, Bartlett finally got his football team. And you can see Old Michigan Stadium taken in 1981 before they remodeled it. We trained what we referred to as the all-volunteer army when we first came here. And in the middle is Lynn Stachel and Jeff Stoller, which were part of the original Elite 8 ECMO specialists that were trained here. And then occasionally there was a little bit of a break in the action. You can see Robert Bartlett there on his sailboard on the middle of Walloon Lake, usually in the middle of summer. The clinical model transition from maybe 1 patient or 2 patients a month if we were lucky. The one on the left is at Irvine, Albert Arvizu, which was one of the first diaphragmatic hernia patients that we took care of. His mother's on the side, and Shannon Chavez, who was Albert's primary nurse taking care of him. But that evolved to Holden at the U of M, where we could do a double header with this traditional model of 1 ECMO specialist and a bedside nurse. A bit later in the 1980s, we would convene together. Here's a wonderful picture of Wanda and us in Bartlett's house at Stain. Great look and presence that he had. But at Stanford in 1989, at my wedding, it was a reunion. And there's Shay Gazaniga, Alan Gazaniga, Karen Bartlett, Wanda, Keith Bartlett, myself, Bob Bartlett, and then Robin Chapman. And I cannot express my sincere gratitude to Bob Bartlett hiring Robin Chapman, because Robin Chapman took the ECMO specialist to the next level. She created FTEs, it became a cost center, and it made lots of money. And if it wasn't for Robin Chapman, the U of M program would not be where it ultimately evolved to. The project also evolved where the fact is that in 2004, a circuit was donated to the Smithsonian Institution. It's crated up, and it's probably by the Ark of the Covenant somewhere in some warehouse in Washington somewhere. So if it starts to glow somewhere, you can fully understand that. We also had the first initial fellows that we have, and I have to really say a couple of things about them. The Zeeberger, who's there on the top left, he came up with some of the great Zeeberger impressions, such as "They ain't nothing like VA bypass." But my favorite is "I wonder what it's like to be a good dog." Swish and I have been dear friends for many times. To Swish's left is the Marshal Peter Dillon, who Charlie loaned us for a couple of months, who came and learned and really bailed us out, and Charlie benefited from Peter's time. Peter became a great pediatric surgeon and has done great things at Penn State. Alice Andrews, shown below, was the first Michigan ECMO fellow, period. She was a pediatrician who was trained as a neonatologist and bridged the time when we first came here that we could get into that unit and such. And lastly, Bob Silley. Bob Silley was an accomplished pediatric surgeon, a dear person, and he truly was the foundation, the originator, along with Sandy Snedeker, of the ECMO registry. I was given a lot of credit for it. That was my grad school project, but it was really Bob Silley and Sandy Snedeker who did line, comma delimited variables that led to the data generation that made the thing better. Lastly, you can see Ron Herschel and Kurt Heiss as fellows there and such. But finally, on a personal note, it's important for me to sort of acknowledge what Bartlett's thing to me was. He instilled upon me and reinforced the love for classical music. And every May, on the early parts of May, the Ann Arbor or the Universal Musical Society would have May Festival. That was 4 consecutive nights of Eugene Ormandy and the Philadelphia Orchestra with world-class artists such as Itzhak Perlman, Yo-Yo Ma, Judith Blagan, and many others that were just great. It was a wonderful, wonderful time here. And last night we heard the Victors as Written for Orchestra, which is truly one of the most beautiful pieces of the Michigan Fight song I have ever heard. So with that, I'm going to thank you very much for your time and attention, and it's been a great pleasure.
Okay, we do apologize.
Why would you want to do that? And in fact, it might be risky to patients, especially with this invasive procedure that's called ECMO. Most of the practicing community thought, this is crazy. Do you know what that guy in California is doing? Putting babies on this complicated machine, and they're all going to bleed to death, and it's a terrible thing. They just shouldn't be doing it. So the practicing community, even the academic community, is very reluctant to buy into any kind of new procedure, especially if they didn't think of it.
We apologize, we're going to go a little over time. What we wanted to do is very quickly highlight some of the very early clinical ECMO when it really was kind of a fight within hospitals. So Tom Crummell could not join us, but he is joining us by Zoom. And maybe just a few comments. Thank you, Tom.
Good. So thank you all for the privilege of joining. I'm so sorry that a snowstorm canceled my flights, but privileged to join you by Zoom. I'm one of hundreds of Bob's disciples, and I'll echo a few themes that you've heard throughout. Let's see, slides are not advancing. God damn it. So here's the MCV story. It was May of '79. I was a PG2 on ped surgery rotation. We did 2 perfect operations on 4-kilo babies with diaphragmatic hernias. And then we watched helplessly as they died of hypoxia, or as truth be told, pulmonary hypertension. Literally 2 weeks later, a young hotshot, Bob Bartlett, gives an MCV surgical research talk on ECMO to rescue such kids. The surgery team was in attendance. At the end, Arnold Salzberg elbows me and says, "Crummell, go speak to Bartlett." I say, "Who, me?" Arnold Salzberg was the Pied Piper in my era. And Arnie says, "Hey, Crummell, how many more kids are we going to watch die before you do something?" So I go up and speak to Dr. B. He says, "Come to Irvine, I'll teach you." And we all know the punchline, "It'll be great." Months go by, I'm in a basic science lab year in 79 or 80, head down working, and I get an overhead page to pick up an outside call. It's Bob. "Come to Irvine now. 2 kids going on ECMO." Again, "Who, me?" Salzberg says, "You dumb shit, go." A crash course in neonatal ECMO, a wonderful reception by the CHOC UCI crew, thanks to John T., Nancy Wetmore, and the care teams. And you'll never guess who picked me up at the airport. You guessed it, Bob Bartlett, fresh from his hockey practice. My hotel was a cot in the NICU at CHOC for 10 days. I never left. Bob would come by a couple times a day and ask questions of a clearly clueless me. And a new book would show up every day: pumps, gas exchange systems, blood surface interactions. For me, it was a crash course in bedside biomedical engineering. All I could do was try to be a sponge. Both kids survived. Very surreal. I fly back to MCV with a duffel bag full of ECMO stuff: tubings, SciMed oxygenator, bladder box, ACT instructions, again, thanks to John T. I get back to Richmond, and with the full support of Laser Greenfield, who obviously has got a Michigan connection, Laser kind of green-lighted an animal lab, techs, and a few bucks, and Arnie's relentless kibitzing, we started an ECMO laboratory. It's interesting, Bob's selection criteria had been criticized by the non-combatants. You're just putting well babies on, and they're, of course, they're doing okay. So I reviewed the last 50 NICU respiratory deaths at MCV. There were no survivors with an AA gradient over than 650. So they were really dying. And that helped a lot in bringing the neonatology crew along. We had several successful sheep perfusions. The neonatologist interest was piqued, and my thanks to Dawn Mueller, Kathy Kirkering, and Barry Kirkpatrick. The perfusionists, of course, belonged to CT surgery, and they were busy doing cases. So the ECMO team became 2 dog lab technicians, a NICU nurse, my wife Susie, and me. We're talking a malpractice opportunity of a lifetime. And here is the first clinical circuit being primed on the floor of a dog lab. More gory details, all on me, but within 6 months, we had 6 ECMO survivors in a row, all with 100% predicted mortality. Surreal, and this is the first case. This was presented at the surgical section of the AAP in New Orleans in October of 1981. We were flying high. Then 3 consecutive deaths of acute renal failure and multi-system organ failure. If that order had been reversed and the deaths came first, I'd still be bagging groceries at Safeway. Arnold Salzberg took all this in, and he said, "You know what? Bob Bartlett proved ECMO could be done. Crummell proved anybody could do it." Bud Randall, who was a senior surgeon at Children's National, as we swing into the Children's National piece, had this take when I had lunch with him in October of 2012, and I recounted this story. Judd said, "You know, Tom, the good Lord takes care of drunks, ne'er-do-wells, and surgeons." I never had the opportunity to ask him which group he thought I fit in. I'll close with this. Dr. B, with gratitude for your example and mentorship. It was life-changing, and you had your arm around so many of us. Thank you.
We are next going to hear a few brief words from Dr. Billy Short, who is also on Zoom.
Yes, I want to thank you. And I'm also sorry. You know how DC is. If we get 1 inch, well, we got 8 plus 3 inches of sleet. So here I am. Anyway, I've been amazed at all the talks this morning, watching everyone working in parallel, but with one focus, which is Bob Bartlett. We were losing 6 to 8 term kids at our institution back in the 80s. And luckily for me, I was a very junior neonatologist, and we were Marilee Miller and myself were talking with Kathy Anderson, who was the associate chief of pediatric surgery one day about a diaphragmatic hernia who just died. And she said, you know, we need to go up to Michigan and meet with Dr. Bartlett, who she was very familiar with and friends, and learn about this thing called ECMO. And so I said, sure. And so we got a little team together, went up to Michigan. And I think as John mentioned, I would like to thank him, besides Bob Bartlett helping us. But John explained to me that day when we went up why this patient was on a hydrochloric acid drip. And apparently that's how surgeons were treating metabolic alkalosis at the time. And I was amazed as a neonatologist and took that back home, but never used it. And as John said, Robin Chapman was essential. Our coordinator spent many, many hours with Robin on the phone, and John helped our bioengineer design a bladder for our circuit. But I found the old manual. I wanted to share some of that with you guys because this was very inventive. As we medical people were getting involved, the education material was altered a little bit. And looking back at this manual, which was typed at the time, you could tell it was hand typed. There was a circuit to explain ECMO to we medical people. It had the hot and the cold, and if you wanted more hot, you turned on the hot spigot. And that's how he explained us what ECMO really was at the time. And I learned that pretty easily. The circuits were really much easier back then. As you can see, not much in them. The old bladder box, which we now don't have because no one's making the bladder, but Bob was the one who showed us that this is a capacitant, and John Tomation, chamber that decreases the hemolysis, especially with centrifugal pumps. And now we don't have it in the circuit, and we have to wonder if some of the hemolysis is not caused by that. I just put this in because they did have VV ECMO in the training manual back then. And I don't know if John Lilly's in the audience, but he thinks that he's the one who invented this. But no, it was, again, Bartlett's team. I also pulled out the preface for the manual, and this was the one statement that many of us who worked alongside Bob every year, he would say, yeah, we're going to have a heparin bonded circuit that we will be able to run without systemic anticoagulation. So I think you guys are still working on this at Michigan, and Gail Onich, that was her fellow, that was her one of her projects. That's why she loves platelets so much. But so we're still waiting on that, Bob. If you hear us, you need to get this circuit for us. Just for us, again, I want to acknowledge Kathy Anderson, who was, again, the associate chief of peds surgery. Without her at our place, because she had the power, I, again, was a very junior neonatologist, but she was able to take the concept of having this kind of a program forward to our CEO, who allowed us to move forward and funded the program. We were very lucky at the time. Our critical care peds people did not believe in it, and they were not supporting us. So there was a lot of negative things going on within the institution. Marilee was my partner in crime. There were two of us doing it for 2 years. So we alternated every other night call. The first year staying in-house, that's where I learned how to sleep on the floor. And again, Pam Krismer was our coordinator, who for the first 2 years was in the hospital most of her life. And I have to say, Ozzie Rivera Bioengineering, when you have a circuit that you have to put together and build, he built our bladder boxes. Since Bob wasn't selling his to us at the time, we wouldn't have been able to get off the ground without having bioengineer very involved. When we started our study, Bob was still doing the play the winner, and we started treating patients. And Pearl was designing and fighting with her neonatologist, the opposite for my place, to do the study in Boston. But we were treating patients, treating it as a therapy that worked. So this was why a lot of the negative neonatology, especially Millie Stallman, who was one of the mothers of neonatology, who I looked up to, one who put a patient on the negative pressure ventilator for the first time. And she was, this is from Charlie, who saw her speak one time. He said, you know, ECMO, SMECMO. If you knew how to treat babies, you wouldn't need these surgeons to come in and slit their throats. So we invited her to speak at our meeting in Colorado one year. And she was quite interesting. She actually had played around with ECMO in her animal lab too. But the medical people, Pearl and I, she being critical care, me being neonatology with my 4 diseases, she says, that I take care of, we're able to continue to work on this. I had the pleasure of being in Washington to go out and meet with Ted Colombo, which you've already heard a lot about, but he designed this silicone membrane for all of us. And actually, I think is one of the reasons that we were able to move it forward. But he was designing it for premature babies. And actually, these small membrane lungs, he and Dr. Avery at my institution back in the 60s treated premature babies, but because of the heparinization, they all died of intracranial bleeding. They could actually perfuse them very well. But it was very interesting talking to him. That picture at the top is of the machine he used to create the silicone layers needed to be able to have a membrane that would pass the gas back and forth, but not, it would still work as a agent. He said Dow Chemical couldn't do this for him, so he had to create his own machine. It said it was in the basement of the administration building at NIH, so every time he cranked it up, it smelled like, rubber in the whole administrative building. And we branched off after going to Michigan multiple times, getting John tired of us, and decided to have a little meeting out in Colorado because we really didn't know what we were doing. So this was our first meeting out in Snowmass, Colorado. And I'll just point to Barbara Town, and who I think John mentioned was her surgery. She was there. John Tomation was there, plus 37 people, I believe. So we're now in our 42nd year, still having fun, still learning how to do this therapy with everyone. And Bob was always there, came every year, supported my meeting, even, with ELSO starting, he was quite busy with all of his work, but he came and participated in our conference and was so supportive. The last year he came, the altitude was getting to be a little bit of an issue, so we had him do a video in for us. So we were his disciples, followed him because of his mentorship. My career exists. And even though I was told from one of the older neonatologists that this would destroy my career if I went to hit down this road, but here I am. So I think that they'll discuss this later. And I have the pleasure of introducing you, and although Pearl will too, I'm sure, to Charlie Stoller, who I trained in ECMO. He was a fellow at our institution, and he trained with Judson Randolph. So, but I'll take credit for training Charlie. So,
Thank you, Billy. Okay. Now, our last speaker is Charlie, and then please do not leave as soon as he stops because we want to get a picture of everyone, okay? Even if it's not okay, we're getting a picture of everyone.
I was assuming people would leave as soon as I started, so that's thank you for that, Pearl.
They're being polite.
When Pearl and others asked me to participate in this amazing gathering of souls today, I wasn't sure quite what to say, but many of us had a chance to be here during the last ELSO meeting, and Bob and Wanda were sitting in there, and I had a chance to tell him directly, why he was important to me. So I'm not going to repeat that, but I know he heard me. I've had 3 important mentors in my life, people that I would want to be like, professionally at least. Bob was one. The other was Olga Jonason, who was chief of general surgery and transplant surgeon at the University of Illinois. When I was a general surgery resident who wanted to know why I wanted to do pediatric surgery, because it's just little people with big diseases. But she's an amazing woman if you ever had a chance to meet her. The second was Judd Randolph, who created many of us. And Bob Bartlett. Always wanted to be like him. Never succeeded, but I always wanted to be like him. I'll begin with a bit of a tangent because people are telling stories. Bob did love music, and when he came to visit us in New York, I took him to the opera. I think it was La Traviata. And we always went to dinner at Picholine. It was a terrific restaurant about 2 blocks on 64th Street. And we were running late, and the main reason to go to Picholine was the cheese course. The fromagier was an amazing guy. And we didn't have time to finish it, so he gave us a leftover dish, went to the Metropolitan Opera. Lights go up, and we have this leftover dish that he puts on the floor while there's all these heating ducts coming up through the floor. And this leftover cheese is getting, you know, a little aromatic. And he turns to me and he says, "I think somebody needs to change their underwear." I do remember that. My ECMO history begins before I met Bob. I was an aging second-year pediatric surgery fellow at the then called DC Children's, or Children's National Medical Center. What do you call it now, Billy? Whatever, but it was the DC Children's as far as I'm concerned, because I'd been a medical student there. And I think it was in August of that year, a 4-year-old had climbed up on a huge 50-gallon fish tank. It was up on a big stand and pulled it over under her chest and managed to disrupt her right mainstem bronchus and a big lung contusion, and was in the PICU. And I know there's some PICU people, PICU docs here. I apologize if I insult you. I just apologize. But the neonatologists just sort of keep us in abeyance. They keep us in a closet. The PICU people hate us. They hate us. Sorry, Des. So, but this girl had this massive lung injury and was dying. And Peter Altman, who was an attending and had not yet moved to New York, knew Bob Hardesty in Pittsburgh, where I think Tom Crummell had since migrated, and where Bob Hardesty was. And their current pediatric surgery fellow was a young man by the name of Robin Wright. And Hardesty and Wright came to Washington to put this kid on ECMO. Ted Colabo came over from the NIH with his oxygenator. And I remember saying I'm watching this, and I'm saying to Colabo, "How do you know how well that oxygenator works?" He says, "Well, there's this little old lady at the end of the line. It depends how she feels it." He goes, how tight she makes the spool. And that's probably true. And so they put this 4-year-old girl on ECMO. She promptly bled to death. They managed to get her back to Pittsburgh, but she died of hemorrhage. But that case got my attention. And I didn't really know what I was going to do with my pediatric surgery career, but that got my attention. I knew that life did not begin with Bob Bartlett. I mean, Priestley discovered oxygen in 1754, called it phlogiston. Lavoisier, who got his head chopped off during the French Revolution, coined the term oxygen. So there's a longer history than we have time to go into. But I first became exposed to it through people in Pittsburgh. And Robert Jeffries finished his fellowship and moved to Irvine, where Bartlett had been. And he called me, he says, "You need a job. Why don't you come out here to Irvine? We do ECMO in Irvine." Okay, so Carol, my wife, of now almost 51 years, we went out to Irvine to visit. And those scenes, I remember, Bartlett had since migrated to Ann Arbor. But the Quonset hut, where you'd done your experiments, was still there. And the technician that you worked with, I can't remember the gentleman's name, I'm sorry, he was still there, and he showed me around this Quonset. There was blood all over the place. The walls, the ceilings, it was everywhere. It was disgusting. And I saw the avocado tree. That was real. So, and my wife and I wanted to live in California in the worst way. And so, and this was the only job. Children's Hospital, Orange County, was sort of across the parking lot, not available. That's where John German was. So I said, okay, I want to come to California. Well, about a week later, Robin Jeffries died in a terrible automobile accident. He was trying to sell his yellow Porsche 911 and drove it into a tree. And so that was the end of going to California. And so I ended up in New York, where I met Peter Dillon. Peter Dillon was then just finished his second year, about to be a third-year general surgery resident. And he was looking for something to do, and Altman says, here's your research fellow, what do you want him to do? I said, well, I'm interested in this ECMO thing. And I said, so why don't you go to Ann Arbor? And he says, who's going to pay for it? I said, I don't know. So we wrote checks out of the Division of Pediatric Surgery slush funds and sent Peter. I think he lived with Wanda and Bob for a period of time. He's living in this backseat of his car. He's cooking hot dogs over Bunsen burners. I don't know what was going on. But it was very important because he went there on site to see what was going on. And what the most important thing he brought back with him was the circuit schematic from Medtronics of how to put the circuit together and how to melt the ends of the chest tubes for the cannulas. And so he came back after about 6 weeks in Ann Arbor, and we were futzing around in the lab. Peter's other expertise, because he had been at Columbia for much longer than I had been, and he knew where to steal things. And we stole a cafeteria cart. We stole the Gamar pump they used for decubitus ulcers. We stole an ACT tester. We stole some old analog pressure equipment and built this ECMO. We got syringes from the guys in the park across the street. It was great. And we were futzing around in the lab with a bunch of sheep, and we had adult sheep on ECMO, this big cage, and we're sitting there eating pizza one day. Oh, by the way, this sheep lab is right next to the adult heart transplant service. And we're sitting there eating pizza one day, and NIH decided to make an emergency visit, and they walked in, and the sheep go whoosh, and whipped the cannulas wide on the neck, and there's blood shooting all over the place. There's the NIH inspectors, and Dylan and I are sitting there eating pizza. It was an awkward moment. I know, you want me to hurry up. Yeah, I know. But one thing led to another, and then in December of that year, we got a call from Stamford, Connecticut, a newborn with diaphragmatic hernia. So I'm a surgeon, I'm interested in this problem. When I was a pediatric surgery fellow, I took care of 25 kids with diaphragmatic hernia, 100% mortality. I never saw one live. So this kid came down from Stamford, Connecticut, operated on as an emergency. That was the standard of care then. He had his honeymoon period, and then he was dying. Keep in mind, Columbia gave rise, this is where Virginia Apgar was, who I met. That's another story. Also the home of Jen Wong and L. Stanley James. L. Stanley James is the first to operate on the human fetus doing blood transfusions for Rh disease. Virginia Apgar was Virginia Apgar. And Jen Wong, who you could never understand the word he's saying, but he developed this idea of permissive hypercapnia and spontaneous ventilation, and nobody was going to die on his watch with that approach. And so this kid with diaphragmatic hernia was dying. And I said, we've got this stuff in the lab, it's covered with sheep's wool and stuff, and they gave us permission to do this. So I called Bartlett up and I said, and I could call him Bob by then, not Dr. Bartlett anymore. I said, Bob, they've got this, we got this DH. I know of the couple that Tom Crummell did in Richmond. There's not a lot's been done. He says, just go do it. Just go do it. You've got everything you need. Just go do it. Okay, so we did, and the kid lived. And I promised you, if he had died, it would have been the last one. They put us in a room in the back of the NICU that had been built for fluoroscopy with an exomat, and that's where we slept. Dylan and I shared 12-hour shifts. We had conjugal visits. It was great. And just not really. What? You not liking this? How could we have a meaningful relationship? You want to eat lunch or you want me to continue? You want me to continue, right? But one thing led to another, and it had Jen Wong and John Driscoll not given us permission, this never would have happened. Not long thereafter, we did a bunch. We wrote, and we had this idea that maybe some babies shouldn't be put on ECMO, and we've been pilloried for that, this selective use based on preductal blood gas assessment. And Bartlett says, you're onto something. There are some babies that need something other than ECMO. And so every step along the way, he was unbelievably supportive of what we were doing. One night on Christmas Eve, I called him and I said, Wanda answered the phone. I said, I need to talk to Bob. Okay, she wakes him up. And I said, I have a pair of conjoined twins, and they're sharing a heart and a liver, and they both need ECMO. How do I do this? So he walks through how to cannulate conjoined twins. I was making the whole thing up, but he gave me and he calls me the next day and went, oh, how are they doing? So that was classic Bob. Well, you going to cut me off?
Yes. After that story. Make these words count.
So just give me 1 second. Give me 1 second. Now you ruined my train of thought. I need to pay tribute to the nurses that took care of these children. I've heard a lot about the nurses at Michigan, in Irvine, the nurses at Columbia. They ran to this fire. The neonatologists, they ran for the hills. But the nurses, they saved these children's lives. I can't begin to thank their skill set and their advocacy enough. I want to thank John Tomasian because he gave us a bladder box. And I think Ozzie Rivera built one for us in Washington at one point, but you gave us our first one. And we used to stuff it with index cards, and then we'd take the index cards out to wean them one at a time. The point of, I guess I'll just close with this, the point that the unifying concept amongst all of us, we all think we're Bob's best friend. Because when he talked to you, you were the only person in the room. He had an incredible generosity of spirit. And every one of us talks about him like we were the only person he needed to talk to in the world. We were it. We were his universe. And I still savor that. Everybody thinks we're in his inner circle. We were in his inner circle. His ability to bring people in and feel like they belong, they're welcome, they were valued, they were taken seriously. He was interested in what they had to say, even though they needed to change their underwear. So thank you for your time.
Thanks, Carol.